It started like any other flight boarding calls. Tired passengers shuffling down the aisle, and the usual scramble for overhead bin space. But row 30. That's where things felt different. She boarded quietly, carrying a worn handbag and Mag. A calm smile, dressed in simple clothes that didn't fit the usual first-glance judgment of a frequent flyer. From the moment she sat down, a few rows ahead, whispers began. Some passengers exchanged looks, smirking. One even nudged his friend and muttered something under his breath. A woman nearby chuckled, clearly joining in. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention from the flight crew, but loud enough to sting. No one really knew her story. No one cared. To ask, the plane filled up, and the hum of conversation turned to silence as announcements played. Takeoff was smooth. Cruising altitude reached without issue. But all eyes, intentionally or not, kept flicking back toward row 30. A young couple across the aisle shared a private joke. A middle-aged man 2 rows up tilted his phone to show a meme he'd made. Mockery doesn't always come with shouting. It can be quiet, casual, cruel. She never looked up. Just stared ahead, hands folded neatly as though she'd been through this before. Maybe she had. Maybe more times than anyone there could imagine. And then, at 35,000 feet, something changed. It wasn't just the weather. The jet gave a sudden, sharp jolt. People gasped, seatbelts strained, drinks spilled. A second shudder followed, stronger. Passengers who were laughing minutes ago were now gripping their armrests. Panic flickering in their eyes. That's when it happened, something no one on that flight expected. Not the mocking passengers, not the crew, and certainly not the woman in row 30. What she did next silenced the entire cabin. But that part of the story comes next. The cabin lights flickered, just once, barely noticeable if you weren't already on edge. A baby began to cry in the back, and the nervous laughter that had filled the first part of the flight vanished into a thick, shared silence. The woman in row 30 slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Not with panic, not even with urgency. Calm, precise. The same way she had boarded and bothered, almost as if she'd expected something like this. People noticed her. Now, really noticed. Not the baggy sweater or the soft shoes, but her posture. The way she stood firm while the aircraft trembled slightly again. One of the men who'd laughed earlier whispered, "Is she a flight marshal or something?" But the question wasn't meant to be answered. Because truthfully, no one had a clue who she really was. The crew moved quickly, trying to keep things under control. A flight attendant's voice came over the speaker, trying to reassure passengers that turbulence was normal at this altitude. But the tone didn't quite match the message. There was a strain in it. Like she was reading from a script, but didn't believe a word. The flight was only halfway to its destination. But suddenly, time seemed to stretch with every rumble of the fuselage. The woman reached into her bag, carefully pulling something out and tucking it under her sweater. Nothing alarming, just a small book, worn at the corners, pages yellowed with time. She closed her eyes briefly and held it like it meant more than anything in the world. Her lips moved without sound, and if anyone had been paying closer attention, they would have seen the shimmer of something like furor, maybe preparation. No one was laughing anymore. All the jokes stopped. And still, no one could figure out what exactly was she waiting for. Or worse, what did she know that they didn't? The plane jolted again, this time with more force. Overhead bins rattled. A coffee cup slid off a tray and shattered near the aisle. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, steady but tense, asking everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. "Unexpected turbulence," he said. But something in his voice didn't sit right. It was the kind of calm that felt too controlled, like someone was trying not to show fear. Row 30. Once ignored, was now the center of every sideways glance. The woman sat back down, book still in her lap, fingers tracing the cover. Her eyes didn't wander. She wasn't panicking like the others. A man across from her finally spoke. "Are you okay?" She gave him a small nod. Nothing more. Just that. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, things weren't adding up. The radar had picked up something strange, pockets of turbulence where none were forecasted. Co-pilot Ramirez leaned over his screen again. "These readings don't make sense," he muttered, almost like interference. The captain said nothing at first, but his grip on the controls tightened. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just rough air. And it wasn't over. Back in the cabin, two passengers whispered about the woman. One thought she looked familiar. Maybe from some news story a few years back, something about an emergency landing, or a passenger who saved a flight under bizarre circumstances. But no one could quite place her. The more they talked, the more they began to wonder if she'd been on this kind of flight before, not just as a passenger, but as someone who knew things no one else did. At the rear of the plane, a flight attendant struggled with a jammed storage panel. Behind it, a faint beeping noise was pulsing steadily. It wasn't part of any equipment she recognized. She froze, eyes widening. And up front, the turbulence wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. The plane suddenly dipped. Not enough to cause injuries, but enough to send every heart racing. Gasps echoed down the aisle as passengers grabbed armrests and each other. Oxygen masks didn't drop, but a few people reached for them anyway, unsure of what was coming next. In row 30, the woman stayed still. Her eyes were wide open now, locked straight ahead. Her lips no longer moved in silent prayer. She was listening at the back. The flight attendant who had found the strange beeping sound radioed the cockpit. Her voice was shaky. "Captain, there's something behind panel 6B. It's not supposed to be there." The message cut out mid-sentence. Static followed. Then silence. The cockpit crew exchanged looks. The captain tapped the console, switching. "Frequencies, Jessica, come again." No reply, only the soft crackle of static. The radar flashed again, erratic readings, like electrical interference, maybe even jamming. "That's not turbulence," Ramirez said under his breath. "Something's wrong with the plane." Meanwhile, passengers had noticed the shift. The tension in the air wasn't just fire, it was confusion. The usual rules of air travel weren't applying here. Crew members were rushing back and forth, whispering instead of speaking through the intercom. Phones were useless at this altitude. There was no connection, no updates. Just the eerie, growing sense that something was unraveling. The man sitting across from the woman in row 30 leaned closer. "You know what's happening, don't you?" he asked. She didn't answer. But slowly she turned toward him. "I hoped it wouldn't follow me," she whispered. The cabin lights dimmed, then flickered again, longer this time. Out the window, storm clouds began to gather in a place where the sky had been clear moments before. Lightning forked silently in the distance. Someone screamed from the back. The plane shook once, more harder than before. Everyone held their breath, and then the emergency lights flickered on. The woman in row 30 finally stood again. Only this time, she wasn't the only one moving. The woman in row 30 stepped into the aisle just as the lights dimmed completely, leaving only the glow of the emergency strips along the floor. But before she could take another step, a sharp, metallic bang echoed from beneath the floorboards, somewhere near the cargo hold. Passengers jolted in their seats. Some shouted. Others looked wildly around, searching for answers in the eyes of strangers. The cabin was no longer just tense, it was unraveling. Then the second twist hit literally. The plane veered slightly, then jerked back like something had pulled at it from the outside. Overhead bins popped open, luggage tumbling into the aisles. Screams rang out. Crew members tried to calm the chaos, but they were clearly as confused as everyone else. It wasn't just turbulence anymore, it felt deliberate in the cockpit. The captain's controls locked for a second too long. Warning lights lit up the panel, but no mechanical failures were registering. "Something's overriding our systems," Ramirez said, voice trembling. "This isn't atmospheric." The radar screen flickered violently, then went black. Communications were down across all channels, back in the cabin. A man business suit, mid-40s, rose from seat 16A. He moved with strange confidence, brushing past panicking passengers, heading straight toward the woman in row 30. She saw him coming and didn't flinch. When he reached her, he stopped short and whispered, "They found us." His voice was low, urgent. "You said it was over." The woman's face didn't change. "I thought it was," she replied, but something in her voice cracked just slightly. Then she turned to him, stepping closer. "How did they track you?" Before he could answer, the emergency exit light above them flickered. A strange sound, like a high-pitched whine, pierced the cabin. Every electronic device on board suddenly blacked out. Phones, screens, navigation systems. And then, as if pulled from the sky itself, the plane began to drop. Not plummeting, but slow, controlled. Unnatural. The passengers screamed. The crew ran for their stations. But the woman in row 30 and the man from 16A just looked at each other, because somehow they both knew this was only the beginning. The cabin was chaos, people crying, shouting, holding on to whatever they could as the aircraft continued its strange, silent descent. But up front, something had shifted. The woman in row 30 stepped forward with a steady calm that didn't match the scene around her. The man from 16A stayed close behind, eyes scanning every corner of the plane as if expecting something or someone to appear. Suddenly, the emergency door sensor above them lit up red. Not green, red. A warning. Something was trying to open. It from the outside. At 30,000 feet, a flight attendant shouted, "Ma'am, sit down. It's not safe." But the woman didn't stop. Instead, she turned to the crew member and said, "It's not outside. It's already here." In the cockpit, the captain finally managed to reboot one of the systems, while the controls were still stiff, almost like the plane was resisting. Then, the cabin intercom crackled to life on. No one had touched it. A distorted voice came through. Not human, garbled, mechanical, but with a chilling clarity. "You were warned. You should have stayed hidden." Passengers froze. Some clutched each other. Others whispered prayers. The woman raised the book she had held earlier, now opened. Inside wasn't just writing. There were markings, diagrams, pages covered in coded symbols. The man beside her reached into his coat, pulled out a small, unmarked device, and flipped a switch. A faint hum began to fill the cabin, and slowly the strange pressure in the air began to lift. The descent slowed. The cabin lights blinked back. On. Passengers gasped in relief. Systems in the cockpit returned to normal. It seemed over. The woman and the man exchanged one final glance. "We bought them time," she said quietly. "They won't try again on this flight." But as the passengers began to settle, and the crew moved to reassure everyone, a child in seat 1B looked out the window and tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, that cloud has lights in it." Her voice was soft. "Hey, it's following us." The mother leaned toward the window, brushing her daughter's hair aside. For a split second, she saw a faint cluster of lights flickering deep within a thick cloud, moving in sync with the plane. But just as quickly, it vanished. A sharp blink, then nothing. She pulled the shade down, smiled gently, and said, "It's gone, sweetie. Just lightning." But her voice trembled just enough to betray her unease. As the aircraft steadied and began its final descent, the mood inside the cabin slowly shifted. Relief replaced panic. People sat back, wiped their faces, whispered apologies to strangers they'd clung to in fear. The crew regained composure and offered water, blankets, anything to ease the nerves. But no one forgot the woman in row 30. She and the man from 16A remained quiet, unnoticed now in the background. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled safely to the gate, they exchanged one last glance. No words. Whatever they had faced, whatever followed them, had passed. For now, later, after the passengers filed off and phones reconnected to service, some tried to make sense of what happened. Turbulence, mechanical failure, a systems glitch. No one agreed. The airline issued a vague statement. But those who were on board remembered something more. The look in her eyes, the way she moved before anything went wrong, and how, just when it felt like everything was about to fall apart, she had already begun to act. In the end, they never saw her again. No records of her name, no trace of her in the passenger log. Row 30 empty by the return flight. And somewhere above, far beyond radar, clouds still moved with purpose, hiding lights no one could quite explain.